Hey everybody, welcome back to Parkitect. Today it's time for the worst Parkitect scenario, but it's terrible on purpose, I should add. It's Disaster Peaks, and the scenario description states that it's a disaster of an amusement park, unmaintained, unclean, and unsafe. That said, the area is too good to pass up and the existing rides aren't bad once fixed. Pull this park out of the gutter and turn it into a gem. And then there's a lot of things that I need to fix. An overall park rating of 75%, cleanliness rating of 80%, 750 guests in the park, which is quite a few, and no loan debts. I don't know if the park starts out with loan debts, but we'll see how that goes anyway. So let's just get started. I'll introduce this scenario very quickly. This is one of the scenarios which I made, and I'll be very upfront about it. It's directly inspired by Ivory Towers in Roller Coaster Tycoon, which is likewise a park that is terrible, has lots of vandalism and broken rides and things like that. And you basically have to fix up the park and turn it into something better. And I thought that was a really interesting concept for a scenario. It's also one of my favorite scenarios, at least in terms of what you're given, because it has these two interesting dueling coasters. And in addition to that, a swinging suspended coaster, very similar to the one that's in Ivory Towers. And whereas Ivory Towers is called Cloud 9, from what I remember, this one's called Hurricane, so kind of a related name there, but this thing is supposed to be broken from the beginning, as far as I remember, so yeah, there it goes. That thing doesn't work, so we're gonna have to fix that thing. We don't even have any staff, so that's something I'm gonna have to work on. And if you check out the paths, you can see, I'm actually just gonna pause the game before things become even worse. You can see that there's trash and vandalism absolutely everywhere. So altogether, this park is kind of a mess, and we're somehow gonna have to fix this thing. Just fix all of the vandalism and litter, mostly by hiring a bunch of employees, I suppose. Fix Hurricane, and yeah, just kind of go from there. I'm actually wondering what our ride selection is. That's not too bad, actually. A floorless coaster is a decent thing to start with. Not to mention that, as much as this park has its problems from the get-go, these two rides here do have very good stats. So we are gonna have to check up these prices, and these are probably going to be our main sources of revenue from the beginning onwards, and a good way to pay for the repairs that we're gonna have to make. So yeah, let's get started and see if I can turn this park around. Yeah, by the way, so just a quick disclaimer, the silverette you just heard on the intro was recorded a few weeks ago, and I don't know why he sounds like he has a hangover. Maybe I did. Honestly, I can't even tell you, but my voice is definitely screwed on that clip. Don't know what's up with that. Anyway, starting here, I decided that the theme that this scenario comes with is absolute jank, and I wanted to do something about that, so I'm kind of starting all over. Like, I am honestly just gonna roast what I built here before, because it was not good, it didn't look very nice. But then again, I do think that for the majority of these scenarios, I had the idea that everything had to look quite simple. Like, I really wanted to keep the scenery quite toned down so that anybody could jump into these scenarios and build them in whatever way they wanted. So they could either build on the scenery that's already there, or just build a much more generic park and focus on gameplay instead, and it wouldn't look out of place. So forgive my below what you're expecting of me level of the scenery on some of these scenarios, because for me at least, the gameplay was more important than what the scenarios really look like, which, to be fair, it does seem to be a more important thing to some people. Like, some people, even though they play the scenarios, they're really more all about the aesthetics, and especially even looking around the scenarios that come with the game and seeing what they look like, which is also fine. You know, everybody, they're each to their own, I guess. But I really wanted to like hit some sort of middle ground with some of these builds. So Disaster Peaks was quite generic and very simple in terms of scenery when you first get it, even though the setting of the map, I would say, is more unique than just that, and there are some interesting layouts of the coasters. But yeah, I think the scenery is definitely something where, rather than building my completely, the new own things in this scenario, I want to give the existing scenario kind of a makeover, give it some more theming, and see where we can go from there. So my idea was to divide this scenario into 3 different lands. I'd say even 4 different ones, because the entrance area is also going to be its own area, but it's not really going to have a theme as much as the 3 other ones. So we have this area with the 2 dueling coasters, Maelstrom and Firestorm. Then we have the area with the suspended coaster called Hurricane, which is going to have its own theme. And finally, I'm gonna have to build one new area, because I think, you know, with all the work that goes into fixing up the existing parts of this scenario, I'll be able to get a large amount of customers into the park and almost reach the goals of the scenario, but I really just have to build one new area with more attractions to reach the actual objectives. So that's going to be my 3rd area, where I'm gonna have some kind of other theme. Now, I did want to have a sort of common thing among all of these themes, so my idea was generally to make them all based on harbor or ports themes in general. Anything that's related to the sea and some kind of port activity. So my first theme was going to be Viking, sort of very Norse, Nordic, Viking-esque theme. I'm not even entirely sure what to call this, but if you're looking at the building that I'm building right now, you're probably getting some of the vibes that I was going for here. Maybe even a little bit inspired by some of the stuff that you see in Skyrim or some of those other Elder Scrolls games. Lots of woodwork, lots of wooden carving, detailing, which obviously I can't really get into Parkitect, but I'm using all of the small wooden piece borders and pillar pieces to create those sort of details. So it's that kind of vibe which I'm going for. Which, to be honest, I was kind of fighting with the scenery research team again, because I wanted to get the fantasy theme, and I wasn't really sure if the fantasy theme was included in the research that you get in the scenario, but I wanted to try it anyway. So I researched for a bunch of months after, you know, fixing up the park and making sure that the vandalism and trash all over the paths was gone. But they just kept researching things that I didn't want, and I was getting kind of annoyed because I had basically all of the themes already available from the get-go in the scenario. You actually start off with a lot of scenery, so I figured, you know, if fantasy was included, I would get it quite quickly. But nope, I ended up getting race props and sci-fi statues and pipes and all of this kind of nonsense that I didn't need. And I eventually even, you know, gave up researching the scenery at all, because I figured that fantasy just wasn't included in the scenario, because I kept getting everything but fantasy. So I stopped researching and just started building, which is why you can see me building with mostly the default pieces here and using some of these standard roofs to create this structure. But eventually, at some point later in this video, I do end up getting the fantasy theme as soon as I start researching again, which, of course, you know that's bound to happen when you're spending a lot of time trying to get something and you don't get it and you give up. You know you should have just gone for one more attempt and then you would have gotten it. Of course, that's always the case. So I ended up, you know, sort of redoing this building at some later stage to make the roof a bit more interesting and detailed, but the general shape of the building and the placement and the colors and all of that are going to remain intact. And this is really going to be the main weenie and point of reference for this area, I would say. Everything else that comes around it, because I will include a bunch of other buildings and a flat ride, are really just, you know, some added spice to this area, and kind of keeping in mind that the station of these coasters should be the centerpiece of this whole themed land. Which I think it also kind of makes sense, because these coasters are also the star attraction. I always just like to go for that kind of Disney approach where every themed area has its own main attraction that is usually connected to the largest building that draws people into the area and gives it its own kind of identity. Because it just kind of works. In real life theme park design is really effective, but in Parkitect it also means that you can just have these few attractions that you focus on that bring in most of the money, and then create a little area around it with some themed rides and shops and things like that, to, you know, fix up the gameplay aspects of this whole theme park management thing as well. So that's pretty great. I mean, if you look at it in real life, I think some pretty obvious examples of that would be, for instance, Space Mountain or Big Thunder. What's it called again? Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. I forgot the exact name, but you know, that mine train in Disney that's at all the parks, because these are the biggest attractions and you can usually see them from all around the park. They are the main attractions in their respective themed lands. But those themed areas then, you know, once you're brought in by that main attraction, then you always have a bunch of things to do around it and other things to spend your money on as well. So honestly, I think following that approach of Disney parks is quite effective in Parkitect for making parks that manage to make money and look pretty decent as well. It also kind of helps because once you get that sort of main attraction out of the way, then you establish a style for the rest of the area to follow, because I wasn't really too sure how I was going to tackle this Nordic theme in Parkitect. I'd never tried anything similar, and I haven't seen many people do a theme like this either. So once I had the main station building in place, I kind of had an idea of how things could look, what pieces to use, so that made making most of the other buildings a lot easier as well. So after I got the main station in, I built a small flat ride, just a wipeout, which is not really the flat ride that I was hoping for. I was secretly hoping that this park would start out with a pirate ship, because obviously that would be the most fitting for the theme. We don't have that though, and I guess the wipeout is the next best thing, because it's also kind of related to a nautical theme in some way. And after that, I'm just adding a food market where we have some drinks and some burgers and some toilets as well. Now, food and drinks I think are going to be one of the main challenges of this park, because I already noticed that the park is huge and people are going to have to walk a lot, so they're going to get quite tired. And if anybody gets too hungry or thirsty at any point in the park and there isn't, you know, a shop close by, and especially if they're also already tired, they're just gonna get more and more angry as they can't fulfill their needs. So with a park as huge as this one, that's going to be the main challenge, I think. And that's definitely something that made my rating quite low and made people really unhappy for a while. Contrary to the problem that I usually have, which is that I don't have enough intense rides, because this park definitely has enough intense rides already from the get-go, with two pretty good dueling coasters that both actually bring in quite a lot of money as well. And also Hurricane, the suspended coaster, has pretty good stats, I think. Really the challenge here isn't so much to keep people happy with the rides, but rather to look after all of their other needs and sort of build some kind of infrastructure around the existing rides of the park that allows this to actually function as a good park, rather than just a huge expansive park with a couple of good roller coasters, but very terrible otherwise, which is kind of what this scenario starts out with. So moving down here, I'm just adding a small harbor area, because in the end, the idea is that every themed land is some kind of harbor. So I'm just adding a small pier here, and some it was weird how I tried to rhyme the word here with the word pier. That should not be a thing. That's like some Eminem stuff right there. Anyway, just a small harbor area to get the idea of the theme across, even though it is going to be quite simple and very small, and I'm not going to, you know, look too much into it. It's something that I think helps sell this themed area, not to mention create a transition into what are going to be the other future themed lands of this park. Because I do want to pay attention also to how I transition between the different themes, because building different themed lands is something that I also don't have much experience with within Parkitect scenarios. So if this goes well, it's something that I'd like to do in the future as well, but for now it's kind of a test. Now I'm gonna have to apologize here. I lost a bunch of footage because my hard drive was full, so I'm just gonna skip forward a little bit and you'll see some of the stuff that I've built in this real-time section coming up. Alright, so here we go. I managed to turn the park around somewhat, I'd say. It actually ended up making quite a bit of profit once I switched these coasters to 2 train ops. Now, the moment where this happened isn't really visible anymore, but I remember it was in March, year 3, I think, and it's the first time I suddenly shot up to almost 1,000 a month. Operations made such a big difference on this thing. These 2 coasters used to run just 1 train each, so I switched it to 2 trains because there are block breaks in front of the launch and also in front of the station, so it is made to run 2 trains each, and that almost doubled the income that I was making. Of course, it didn't continue the whole time, so especially when there's a thunderstorm, income goes down quite a bit. But altogether, I think it's a good case for why you really need to make sure that your coasters run as efficiently as possible, because the layout isn't the only thing that's really important. Your operations are super important as well. The only thing is, sometimes if the staff in the station is particularly slow for some reason, the coasters aren't in sync anymore. So now we have this situation, which is a bit annoying. It's very sad to not see them dual anymore, and this is probably why I had them set to one train ops. But to be fair, I am taking the Six Flags approach. I don't care about whatever the guests are experiencing on these rides and whether they're actually going to be dueling. I just want to focus on operations and getting as many people through these things as possible. So, yeah, that's how we're going to do this. Other than that, here's just the overall Norse Viking-ish kind of area. Not exactly sure what to call it, but I was just inspired to create some sort of fantasy Viking-esque harbor, so this is what it ended up being. And honestly, I didn't really add too much. I guess I added the wipe out over here, but other than that, I'm pretty much just leaving this area as it is. No new coasters or anything like this. And I am planning to do the same with the area around, I believe this thing is called Hurricane. Yep. And I'm not entirely sure if this is the theme that I will go for, but I think I'm probably going to go for some kind of Catfish Cove, North American kind of wooden harbor town, maybe inspired by the coast of Vermont, or what am I saying? They don't have a coast, do they even? No, they don't. Maine or something like that. Anywhere in the northern parts of North America. Could even be Canada. Some kind of American northern-ish architecture. And then for the other side, because over here there's a big empty plot of land where I'm currently not allowing anybody to go, but somehow these people ended up here and I'm not entirely sure how. Oh, there's security. Did I mess this up? Oh, how did they end up there? Okay, whatever. I'm gonna move these guys. What I ended up doing, of course, is closing off this entire stretch of land, which I think was a pretty good decision. Ooh, there's a connection here. Okay, that's a mistake. But yeah, altogether, it worked out really well because it kept all of the guests in the area where there are rides and stuff like this, so that I can make more money. So I'm really glad with how that turned out as well. And I'm also quite happy with how the waterfront area here came out. I might put a bit more scenery around this section of the layout, but it's going to be really difficult to do that. But I do like the interaction that the waterfront has with the coasters over here. So I think these are just things to take with me into the next themed area. I have to say, I'm already kind of excited about starting a new themed area. So far, every scenario that I've done, I just decided to do everything in one theme, more or less. And I'm really starting to consider why I didn't branch into different themes for some of the larger parks. Because especially for smaller scenarios, I think it makes more sense to stay within one theme. But with how spread out this scenario is, and just how huge this map is, I think it's a cool opportunity to try some different themes as well, and all have them just related to this big Central Harbor theme. So without further ado, let's get back into building and see how it goes. Alright, so it's time to go to the themed area of Hurricane, or well, the area that is currently unthemed and where I want to come up with some kind of way to make it a bit more interesting. Now, I will say that out of the different themed lands of this park, this one's going to be the least detailed, or the least thoroughly themed, if you will, because the theme is going to be quite simple and generic. I'm going for some kind of coastal town in North America, so it's really going to feature a lot of very generic, basic architecture, lots of colored wood, and kind of colonial architecture. So not all that interesting, but I think in the end it ends up looking pretty cool and quite charming, and really manages to bring out the focus on the suspended coaster. And I think it's also an interesting theme to use for this thing, because I figured that this kind of coaster would be too difficult to work into a heavily themed land with lots of buildings, because this coaster needs such a huge clearance between itself and the environment that I really couldn't put as many buildings around here as I did with the Viking/Nordic themed area, and definitely not as much as I am going to with the third themed area of this park. So yeah, this is going to be a bit more simple. I'm just going to have the suspended coaster go through some forests, have it interact with the hills. It's very much, I think, like suspended coasters in real life, like Ninja at Six Flags Magic Mountain does, for instance. These coasters are just so good at weaving their way through a natural environment, making their way on and off some hills, flying through the trees. I think that's just kind of what these coasters do best, and I feel like I would just make a mistake to make a huge themed area around it with lots of buildings and things like that. I think this one is just better kept simple. From my personal experience, Ninja is actually the only one that I've ever been on. But Eagle's Fortress is a coaster that I wish I had been on. It's in Everland, Korea, and it's arguably one of the best coasters that was ever built. It's hard to say this because very few people actually wrote that thing. Now, of course, I guess millions of people wrote that thing, but mostly Koreans, because it's quite a difficult park to get to for international people, and especially within the coaster enthusiast community. It was something that not a lot of people had been to. And the coaster also closed many years ago. It wasn't even open for that long. I believe it was because it was just so intense that the coaster just took a massive strain on the track. And because Arrow had already gone out of business, it's a difficult and costly coaster to maintain. So Everland just decided to, leave it standing but not operating for a few years, and eventually removed it as well, which is a shame because it's an absolute example of what you can do with suspended coasters if you make them a little bit more intense than just your average family coaster, because that thing was swinging from side to side in some absolutely insane ways. It's really cool. I highly recommend checking out a POV if you're interested in roller coaster POVs, because that thing is just really cool. I hope that one day the suspended coaster kind of makes its comeback, and that we don't just have these family suspended swinging coasters anymore, but really some more intense ones as well, because the concept of it is super cool. And it's definitely one of the best coaster types, I think, suited for having this kind of terrain-based interaction. There are lots of really interesting No Limits creations with suspended coasters as well that I'm a big fan of. So yeah, basically, I ended up going way too off topic on that one, but that was kind of the spirit that I wanted to embody with this coaster as well. So I'm adding also a lot of foliage compared to what was already there, because I really want to have this very dense, lush foliage around the coaster that you really get the sense that you're diving through the trees and up and down this hill and going over the paths, just having all this interesting interaction. Especially with the railroad underneath it as well. I think just a general golden rule is the more different things kind of cross their paths, the cooler it ends up looking. And I think this is something that worked in Roller Coaster Tycoon and still is very true today in Parkitect and in real life theme parks as well. Like when different rides have interaction with each other or with the paths or with the natural environment, the more all of these kind of things stack up on each other, it's just so much more interesting and dynamic than a simple coaster placed on a flat plane of a parking lot. Six Flags. So yeah, that's what we're going for here. Now the architecture is also very simple. I'm really just taking my inspiration from the coastal towns in North America, maybe areas like Nova Scotia or Maine, or the West Coast as well. Just these kind of almost Scandinavian-ish buildings, but then with a more American colonial architecture kind of vibe to it. Lots of colored wood and white trims, and very simple, cheap architecture that should work in these kinds of wet and cold climates. And of course, I would say actually the weenie of this area is going to be the lighthouse. Given that, this is a port-themed park, I wanted to have a lighthouse somewhere, and I think this theme deserves it the most. I'm not sure about what kind of lighthouses the Nordic Vikings had, and for the third theme, I think a lighthouse wouldn't be that interesting. So this is the theme where I'm putting that one, and I think that's also going to make the scene at the lake really interesting. Obviously, we don't have a first-person perspective in Parkitect, but having this kind of lighthouse sitting at the lake, I think will look really interesting from the rest of the park. At least that is the kind of fantasy that I'm coming up with in my head. Honestly, I've had a bunch of discussions recently about the art style of Parkitect and what I see in it, because it's interesting how polarizing it is, I suppose, and not necessarily in a bad way. I've just noticed that there are lots of people who really dislike the general art style of Parkitect, and there are people who really like it. There barely even seems to be a middle ground, and I think a lot of it comes down to whether you're into this kind of diorama, the fantasy kind of aspect of it, because obviously in Parkitect nothing is as real as the things that you build in games like Planet Coaster or No Limits. But for me, this is kind of part of the charm. It's like you're building a general idea of something and filling in the gaps in your head as if it's some kind of fantasy, almost in the same way that I used to build Lego cities when I was younger, and I would just try to come up with how things would really look in my head. And for me, that just really works. I love that suspense of disbelief and building something very quickly and very basically and coming up with a kind of lore for it in my head and an idea, because also no matter what you build in a theme park game, I think your imagination is just always cooler, and some of the aspects of that imagination I think are most intact in Parkitect. And I mean that, but also I just like the nostalgic similarity to the art style of Roller Coaster Tycoon games. Now very quickly, to wrap up this area, I added a train station with a very iconic American kind of colonial style spire next to it. I had to add some kind of spire to this area, and that basically finishes this general area. There are a couple of little sheds alongside the water as well, where I imagine boats could be maintained or built or things like this, but other than that, it's really just forests all the way down. So moving from that into what is not really the third area, but I'm just going to count this as the entrance area, because before I went into working on the third proper themed land, I wanted to fix up the entrance, because throughout the whole video, you haven't seen this I think, but I just plopped a bunch of random stuff at the entrance to keep the guests happy, like shops and toilets. But it looked horrible, and I wanted to get rid of that before I finished up this scenario, so I'm adding a proper themed area kind of here. The idea behind this, and here we go with the lore of this park, is that this park is some kind of old estate from some kind of royal family or whatever. So this is going to be where the real palace is, and it's not going to be really big, but it is going to set this theme kind of in a similar way, I would say, to zoos like Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, or maybe even Paradise in Belgium, where you come into an entrance area and you can see that there's older architecture that predates the modern park, and it kind of just creates this really interesting vibe of we're going into a place with history, and even though it currently has this theme park layer to it, it's older than that as well. So there's going to be a mansion here with a symmetrical kind of European garden in front of it. And like I said, it's not going to be too big. I don't want to go all out on this one. Maybe it's even just an old summer park of some kind of old royalty. Whatever the exact backstory is, it gives off the idea that this park is something that used to have a different kind of very high function and was eventually taken over a few decades ago by this theme park sort of function, which is, I don't know, I just like that thing. I think I do it too much. I end up doing it right now in Koali Zoo as well. And fun fact, I was planning my own zoo in Planet Zoo before I realized that I didn't really have enough time to commit to that without sacrificing time to my Parkitect series and things like this. So I didn't end up doing it, but I had the idea for a Planet Zoo build as well, where I start creating this giant old 19th century refurbished castle and build a zoo around that as well. I just love taking old places like this and getting the idea that they've been somehow retrofitted into an amusement park. So it's also interesting because I usually build very simple, more rustic themes in Parkitect, and I've never really built these large-scale symmetrical builds, but just with this small, tiny symmetrical garden, I kind of enjoyed it, and I think there's probably some potential here. I'm not sure if any of the scenarios in the DLC are going to work too well for that, considering that in the main game I think I only have Robo Park and the final scenario to do, so there's not a lot of space to experiment with anymore. But I think if I get the opportunity, I would love to build some kind of classical themed park which follows more of a symmetrical layout, because I always used to think that, you know, it would look really boring in Parkitect and not really as interesting as messy, more small-scaled themed areas are. But at the end of the day, looking at this, I think there is definitely some potential to be had there, especially given that you can very easily create classical buildings with some of the sets that are already in the game. Now, this food corner here is also super simple, but just a really cool showcase of the 3D sign, which was added, I believe, in the DLC patch, which is just super cool. I really love that thing, the fact that you can actually create your own 3D signs with whatever text it says. It's something that I always forget is in the game, but whenever I realize that it's in it, I just want to use it for everything. So from this point onward, I'm gonna try not to forget that that's in the game anymore and make more use of it in some of my scenario builds, because it's really cool and it just allows for so much creativity. I think I remember in Sakura Gardens I actually used it to create some fences which are off the grid, because of course fences in the game, you have to keep them on the grid, but sometimes if you're building something off the grid, you can use some signs to create fences or some other kinds of detail. I mean, the options aren't limitless, but the options are only limited by whatever characters you can come up with to put on the signs and the size and color that you give them. So there are so many things that you can play with there. It's really cool. Now, moving into this next themed area. This is going to be interesting because it's going to be a Dutch themed area. I would say generally, because it's not specifically Dutch. I was more generally inspired by Hanseatic architecture, so it could be somewhere in North Germany or maybe even in Denmark. Anywhere along the lines where the Hanseatic is active. I think Hansa Park is a really, really good example of the kind of theme that I'm gonna go for here. Just red brick houses with stepped gables and things like this. I really love this kind of architecture, and of course it's something that's really close to me personally as well, and I'm still wondering why I didn't try this kind of theme earlier in Parkitect. It's very easily doable, and we have some stepped gable pieces in the game, so it's a theme that's just really fun to build with, and is very possible also to build in Parkitect, because, you know, to what extent a theme is doable in the game is still something that I always want to work out before I dive into it, because the pieces are limited, of course. But this theme, I think, it's very doable, and it's lots of fun to do. There's a lot of stuff available in the game to work with. Now, for the main attraction of this themed land, I'm going with the floorless coaster, which is again a pretty thrilling coaster, so we don't really have anything for kids in the park. I would say that the suspended coaster is a good family coaster because it's not too intense. It's very much like Ninja in Six Flags, for instance. A decent, slightly thrilling coaster, but it doesn't do anything too intense. So with this floorless coaster, we do have another high intensity ride to join the Maelstrom and Firestorm. So maybe it isn't the best decision after all from a park perspective. I just really wanted to build this thing because it's, I think, the most fun coaster type to build that I ended up getting in the research. And I say that I ended up getting it in research, but to be honest, you have this coaster from the get-go in the scenario, I think, and I just started researching to see what else I could get, and ended up getting bobsled coaster and other stuff that I wasn't really looking forward to building, so I'm building a floorless coaster in the end. And it's also just a good one to rake in the money and the guests, because I do need to finish the scenario after all, and I don't want to start making or stop making a profit. So for that reason, the floorless coaster is also just great, because it usually gets a really high excitement rating and has a very good capacity, especially with how pretty short this layout is, and with the block at the end of the ride so that I can run 2 trains. This thing should be able to make me a good deal of money as well, so once we start getting that money, I can pay off my loan, start advertising for the park, and then hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, I'll be able to finish this scenario. So as you might see, I'm really going for a lot of interaction with the path here, and very wide paths alongside this kind of lakeside boulevard. But between the coaster and the path, I do want to add some buildings too. So here on the corner is going to be my first little test with the color of the brick and testing some of the roof pieces and the stepped gables. And looking at that, I figured that I could run with it and just see where it ends up. So I already started out creating some of the facades of the future buildings to get an idea of the overall layouts of this area. This area kind of has two weenies, I guess, and doesn't really as clearly establish one identity, because you will see in a minute that the coaster station and the train station are kind of going to clash a bit, and they're also a little bit hidden between some of the facades here. But I'm not really too concerned about that overall. This is definitely an area that feels much more coherent and whole than the other two themed areas. It's quite small, and it's all just one big interconnected plaza, so I think it works the way that it will. And I'm pretty happy with how some of the detailing came out as well. So even though I wasn't too sure about this in the beginning, it's definitely a theme that has some potential. And hell, I would say that you can do so much more with this theme than I ended up doing here. I'm a little bit sad with how limited I am in what I'm doing, because most of these buildings are just simple 2x2 buildings using the in-game gables. It's really just kind of simple and not too experimental. I think personally I did enjoy my Japanese build of Sakura Gardens, for instance, much more, because it just uses the pieces of the game more creatively, and this theme just, it's literally just putting some boxes of the already existing pieces in the game. So it's quite simple, but it just works too well as well. So I don't know, even though it's not something where I feel necessarily that proud of it, I think it's a theme that just works out really well. So that's mostly why I'm surprised why I haven't tried it before, or why it doesn't seem to be, you know, that much of a commonly tried thing in the game in general. Because it's just really fun. Now, because I have a lot of paths going around here, I do want to fill up all of the available space that I have that isn't paths or a coaster with buildings or foliage, just to not make it look like an empty sea of concrete. So you can see some trees in between some of the planters there, which I think really helps bring this area together. And then behind these facades, I'm adding the coaster station building. And you can probably notice what I was talking about here earlier. It is a little bit hidden, and if you were looking for the lake, you would kind of see it, you know, in the distance and behind some of the facades that are at the waterfront. But I think it kind of works because it is also placed at a higher elevation, and it's also just a taller building. And I'm gonna start adding a dome to the top of this as well. So once that's all in place, I think it at least does a decent job at being a weenie, even though it doesn't have the clear sight lines that some weenies should have. I think the fact that it blends into the rest of the area a little bit more is maybe also somewhat of an advantage as well. I also very accidentally created some clock gables on the sides here. I wasn't really intending on doing that. I was just struggling because this station is 3 blocks wide, which is always a bit annoying because that means that you have to fill in the middle with some kind of different roof piece. And also the gabled roof, the gabled wall pieces, so the stepped gable pieces, they don't have a middle piece. Like you have one for the left and one for the right wall, but you don't have this piece that you would need in the middle. So I was kind of annoyed at that at first, but looking at it in hindsight, it actually works out a lot better as this kind of clock gable, where you see the middle section comes out higher than the sides, which is maybe usually a bit weird, but for this Dutch kind of theme, I think it works perfectly, and it's a kind of gable that you see very often if you go to cities like Amsterdam, for instance. So even though I kind of did it accidentally, once it was in place, I realized that it really helped sell the idea of a Hanseatic / Dutch kind of architecture. So I'm keeping it there. And of course also there is the dome on the middle of the building, which almost kind of makes it look like some kind of chapel. I'm not entirely sure what kind of function this building would have within the context of this theme. But I think despite, you know, how hidden it is and how the location and placement of it isn't quite what I was looking for, it still manages to be a decent weenie to the area, and something that clearly demarcates that this is the station building and this is where you want to go if you want to ride this coaster that is going around this entire themed area. So for the train station, I'm keeping this one a lot more simple. It is basically this 2x2 building that you see at the waterfront, but then stretched to fit the entire footprint of the station building. So a large horizontal kind of section with two facades jutting out at the front. I could have also turned this into more of a station-like building and add a spire to it, some kind of tower or dome. I was very I was almost doing this, but then I realized that if I did this, then the entire building would just end up taking away some of the attention from the coaster station building, and they would kind of start fighting for attention within this theme, and I figured it would make more sense to just make this building a bit more subtle and give it some facades at the front that create more of a harbor city vibe rather than just a bunch of fancy buildings in a forest vibe. I don't know if that makes sense, but I figured it was better for the themed area as a whole to sacrifice this train station and not make it too fancy or detailed, and just make it look much more like some of the other smaller buildings in this area. And after that's done, it's pretty much most of this area in place. The only other thing that's still left to do is finishing up the waterfront and making this look a bit more like an actual harbor city. So just like the Viking area, I ended up adding a small wooden pier and also a teacups ride, which for a second I was considering whether I could make this look like Delft's Blauw, which is a Dutch kind of pottery, but I think it would just be really difficult to get those colors in, so I ended up going for a much more generic color scheme on the teacups here. But all things considered, I think it fits into the theme, especially considering that this themed land is very inspired by Dutch architecture, and Delft's Blauw is a big part of Dutch culture, or at least heritage, I would say. So I'm happy with it here. The only struggle that I still had was what to do with the roof of this thing. Obviously, as you all know, if I place a flat ride, I can't help but add a roof to it. And while I am trying to get out of that habit, because sometimes it's not the best thing to do, for teacups, this is a classic, the flat ride, which has to have a roof on top of it. So I made this roof quite simple, just added some fantasy roofs in the middle, and I'm not sure if I'm a huge fan of this shape. I might come back to that later, but I really just don't have any better ideas. This teacups roof, I guess, just doesn't really need to look nice on its own. It's just kind of here to provide a flat ride and to close off this part of the general area, to just have a big building here. It feels right for the layout of this area is what I'm trying to say, but I'm not sure about the actual design of the roof itself. But I'll probably keep it this way, because I can't really come up with anything that's much better. And even if I do know some roof shapes that I like more than this one, I do still want to try and come up with a new roof design for every flat ride roof that I make. So I'm trying to avoid repetition as much as I can. And this is probably also in vain, like at some point I'm just gonna forget what some of the roofs that I've already built look like. But for the time being, I really want to keep it up, so this is what it is. Now, finally, as what is probably going to be the last flat ride in this entire park, I'm adding one of these things. I totally forgot the name of it, so let's just call it Loop-de-Loop Swinging Ship, or whatever. It's really intense. It's probably one of the harshest flat rides that you can add into the game, but some of the other flat rides in this park are already just the teacups and the Wipeout, which are not that intense, so I think adding an intense flat ride makes sense. Thinking of it now, this park really lacks some of the basic simple flat rides like a carousel or a slide or a chair swing. I really don't have any of that stuff. Maybe I'm actually gonna go back into this thing and add something like that, because it does feel like a flat ride like that is missing in this park. But for now, I think this was a decent ride to add to round up this area. So that is basically it for the Hanseatic area. just adding a little bit of scenery before I move into the final parts of this time-lapse, which if I skip forward to that, you could see is gonna be another train station, because it's just it's just time to add another train station. I started out this park with I started out this park with 3 train stations, of course, because that's what you get when you open this scenario. And I quickly removed 2 of them because they were both in a part of the park that I closed off for visitors because I didn't want people to walk over there and start getting too tired. So I'm slowly opening up those train stations again, and I want to build some kind of unique design for every part. But for this area, I wasn't really sure what to do. I wanted the train station to fit in with the entrance building and the general, very generic look of this part of the park. But then building just a generic train station is kind of boring. So I started going back into my head and reasoning, at what point in time would the park entrance have been built? And what kind of architecture could fit with that? So I was thinking that perhaps this park started, being open to visitors to some extent in the early 20th century. And at that time, there was still a lot of modern and Art Deco architecture going around, and there was a lot of attention in this field. So I figured if there's any kind of modern architecture that I like, that works with train stations, it's probably Art Deco. So this thing is going to have a very simple, stripped down modern Art Deco look to it. I'm really not going to look too much into it. It's not going to be all that detailed. But when it comes to the overall atmosphere, I'm trying to take in some of that Art Deco. So basically, the roof is very simple and just based on what the entrance building is like to make that fit in as much as possible. But I'm adding some classical details here and there, as you would see with Art Deco buildings like pillars. And the spire is really where this mainly comes out. And it's just so simple. It's so simple, it's almost stupid. It's just a bunch of cubes stacked on top of each other with some pillars here and there for that vertical detailing. And it just works so well. Like, this instantly made me think, I didn't spend much time on this train station, and it's really simple. But Art Deco is a theme that is very doable in Parkitect, and with all of the little cube pieces that are off the grid, you can really do a lot of interesting detailing and composition when it comes to Art Deco. So, again, this is maybe one of those themes that I might try at a later stage in time. I'm just really happy that I decided to try different themes on the same map here, because all of this experimentation, even if it isn't, as good as some of my other builds, I think it just shows how much you can still do with the game and how versatile these pieces are, because everything's very simple. That said, that's the end of this time-lapse, so I'm gonna go off screen and finish a bunch of stuff, and then I'll show you the park in its full glory. Alright, well, we are here. It's just a question of whether or not I'm gonna need to hold the goals for a few months. And there we go. And I said I would probably need to hold them for a few months, but it looks like it's only 3 weeks, so that'll be a bit more doable. I ended up having to add this tourbillon at the entrance area very quickly because I wasn't quite reaching the 750 required guests in the park for this scenario. And I'm not really happy with it. I probably should have put some more time into it because it's not really the best placement. But in my defense, I really sort of filled up every space on the map that I figured could be conceivably filled up. There's obviously still a lot of space left, but some of that space is a bit more difficult to get to and would just look a bit strange. I was looking into this area specifically because I thought a small flat ride could actually fit in this first helix of Hurricane and work out quite well. But no, that's not gonna happen because it's just that compact and I don't really have any large flat rides available. So let me just start doing a tour because I'm gonna assume that I'm gonna reach the objectives by the end of these 3 weeks. So now I guess we've all seen the Viking area enough, but I'm just really happy with how these roofs came out. The fantasy roof is just one of my favorite pieces in the game. Just the shape and detail of it is so good for different themes, and I'm really glad I ended up, pushing through and trying to get that fantasy roof in the end, because it really pays off, I think. And even here on the waterfront, which isn't quite as detailed or ridiculously scened, I still like some of the combinations of the colors, even though everything's quite simple, and I'm a bit disappointed in myself that I didn't experiment a little bit more with the pieces. I think altogether it paints an interesting picture, and the themed area is quite coherent as a whole. And then moving into, of course, what I guess I should probably call Hurricane Harbor. That just sounds like the perfect name for this little themed area. Not too much to see, but we've got the suspended coaster going around, which is pretty cool. And then, of course, if we come back to the entrance area, here we have the big sort of landlord house here with the food corner. All very simple, but I think it works all right to establish the mood of the park as a whole. And then moving into this area, a flat ride and the very simple Art Deco station. And God, I know this thing is just super simple and very basic and nothing that I'm particularly inspired by, but I just had this idea for Art Deco architecture and I really want to try it in Parkitect a bit more one day and really see what you can do with some of those basic pieces, because that stuff is just awesome. And I'm gonna try to keep in mind when I'm actually gonna finish the scenario, so looks like we'll just have a minute or so more. And then of course we have the Hanseatic town over here. For a really long time I wasn't really sure what to do with this corner, because I also didn't want to block it off completely, because I wanted the view of the lake side to be maintained here, and also to leave this entire area visible from the other side of the lake as well. So I ended up just putting a very simple seating area here with the tree. Not super happy with it, but I think at least it doesn't disturb the layouts and the flow of the general themed area that's already established. I'm actually gonna do a quick POV of this coaster because I haven't yet, and I know I'm definitely gonna have some comments about it if I don't do it. I think it's not really the best layout that I've ever made, but it works in the context of this themed area, and I think it has some really cool interaction with the paths and the scenery as well, so that's nice. By the way, the stats of this thing are really good. We've got an extreme excitement rating and then a very medium intensity rating, and I can only guess that that is because of the interaction that it has with the train, for instance, or the paths, or some of the scenery, just the amount of scenery around it in general. Either way, this is a ride that works wonders when it comes to income. As you can see, the last few months it's been earning about 1,000 a month pretty steadily. Now I changed the pre-drop shaping because that was a bit strange. I'm still not super happy with it, but I think it works alright the way that it is right now. You might notice, by the way, that it is a tiny bit similar, I would say, to Daemonen in Tivoli Gardens. Definitely a very different layout, but overall it has a similar set of elements and even a kind of similar flow to it, even if it is a lot less compact than Daemonen is. For the longest time, by the way, I was also planning to have some kind of transfer track shed over here, but I'll be completely honest, this themed area feels more or less complete, just like that, and I was too lazy to build a boring shed over here because it's just not something that I think I could realistically experiment with a lot, and it would just be something that I wasn't looking forward to doing. Look, this scenario is already quite large and I've spent a lot of time recording this. I haven't even featured all of my stuff that I worked on in this time-lapse, so it's been a while and I really can't wait to move on to the next scenario. So, with that said, let's leave Disaster Peaks behind. I think at least I've been able to turn this park around and not have it be a disaster anymore, and in fact I'm just really happy with the idea to completely retheme the park and turn it into something very different than what it used to be, with a bunch of different themed lands like this. So with that said, I'm pretty sure this is going to be the trophy of the scenario, as I'm going to go back to the campaign menu. At least, actually yeah, no, I'm entirely sure because I had to make that building specifically for this function. So yeah, there you go. We have that little house in the middle of the lake, which is now plopped down into the lake here. And after that, I think... Oh, yeah, right. There's still one more scenario over here that I forgot about, which is sheer cliffs. That's going to be interesting, actually. I'm Not sure if I'm gonna want to tackle Robo Park first or Sheer Cliffs. I think both of these parks could be really interesting. I know I already always say this, that I don't really know which one I'm gonna do in the next episode, but sometimes there are just these parks that I really want to get to. But with these two, I don't know. I'm not even sure if any of them is easier. I think Robo Park is probably a bit easier, given that... Actually, I'm not going to spoil anything. You guys are going to see that in the next episode. I should just stop talking and leave you to it. So, I'm going to see myself out here. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Bye, everybody.